Hello, welcome to Herp Corner, where we'll be discussing the psychedelic gecko, also known as the psychedelic rock gecko, Cnemaspis psychedelica, or, in Vietnamese, and I'm sorry about this one, Toc Ke Dui Vong. Oops. They're referred to as the psychedelic gecko for their striking body patterns. Their head, limbs, underbelly, and tail are all a bright orange, with their abdomens being a light pink or lavender. Judging based on appearances alone, they definitely have thinner scales than the average gecko, so much so that you can see their spine through their pink scales. We're not entirely sure why they have such conspicuous colors, and what possible evolutionary benefit it might have to them, but there's some speculation that it's an example of aposematism, which is when an animal appears to be distasteful to potential predators. I guess you could say on purpose. They grow up to around 7.5 centimeters or 2.9 inches. They're a diurnal species, which is relatively rare within geckos. Speaking of rare, psychedelic geckos in general are one of, if not the, rarest species of gecko on the planet, due to how tiny their population numbers are, but I'll get into that in a second. The psychedelic gecko was discovered by a group of herpetologists and zoologists studying the herpetofauna of Vietnam. The team consisted of, and I'm so sorry if I say any of their names wrong, Dr. Quan Trong Nguyen, Professor Dr. Vo Quy, Dr. Huan Sung Quan, Vu Ngoc Thien, and Professor Dr. Thomas Ziegler. Thankfully, Thomas Ziegler published his findings and things, so we've got a nice amount of documentation of it. This species is definitely one of the most recently discovered out of all that we've covered, the psychedelic gecko being discovered in 2010, which, for reference, is 10 years ago, compared to a lot of animals having been discovered half a century ago. Isn't that cool? Some people have even said that every day we discover a new animal on Hung Quai Island, an island this animal is native to. I think just how weirdly recent this is can be reflected in the fact that all of the scholars I previously named have an email. If I really wanted to, I could email them this video. I mean, I won't. But I could. Either way, the psychedelic gecko is found in two small islands off the coast of southern Vietnam, called Hung Quai and Hon Sao. Again, sorry if I butchered that, as well as the coast of southern Vietnam itself. The IUCN Red List judges the species as endangered and borderline critically endangered, with only 507 adults known to be in the wild. This is most likely due to a few things. Chances are, if you see the psychedelic gecko for sale at a reptile expo, it's wild caught. To quote Becky Crew from her article on this species, the psychedelic rock gecko has become an unwitting poster child of wildlife trafficking. There's a shocking prevalence of importers targeting the species in the wild, no doubt due to their unique markings and selling them as pets and things. Another cause is their low rate of reproduction versus their rates of predation. Yes, ever since the long-tailed macacos, an invasive non-native species, was introduced to their ecosystem, their population numbers have also been suffering. The long-tailed macacos feed on the geckos and their eggs. Habitat loss is also, of course, a cause. Thankfully, a portion of the land they're native to is protected, though they're still extremely vulnerable to extinction given their already small size and land they populate. The land itself is often some type of forest and rocky areas. In 2014, there was a captive breeding project initiated by Hon Mi Station. The species was studied to do well in such conditions, and it was beneficial for their populations. The psychedelic gecko has been documented to bask in the sunlight during the day and sleep on leaves or in crevices during the night. Considering they're both arboreal and come from relatively tropical places, I'd say that the psychedelic gecko is around the same in care as the crested gecko. Vietnam has an annual average humidity of 85% and a high temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or 39 degrees Celsius. So, effectively, the biggest difference in their care would be the need for a basking spot. A thermal gradient is harder to accomplish with a vertical enclosure versus the typical long one, so the exemplary one next to me is one so big that it makes pulling that off much easier. However, it should be noted that the typical exoteric crested gecko enclosure is a good enough size for them. The cool side of the enclosure should be around 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Definitely provide a decent amount of foliage and things for the gecko to hide in, and a nice substrate of some sort. You could use either fake plastic leaves or a potted plant, though the plant doesn't need to be potted if you happen to go the bioactive route. Speaking of, since the species hasn't been found to burrow, there's no real need for the enclosure to be bioactive with a dirt soil. An easier to maintain bottom would be a reptic carpet, not to mention the fact that since it's thin, it gives you more space for things the animal can climb on. Overall, I'd say it's a good bet. Additionally, the water bowl is also not necessary since arboreal geckos tend to only drink water off leaves and glass after you mist, which, yes, you should mist once or twice a day, at least, to keep the enclosure's humidity up. This species is insectivorous, so a diet of crickets, hornworms, and cockroaches is optimal. Dubia roaches I'd recommend feeding the most of, since they have the most nutrients and are the easiest to breed, next to hornworms. Leave them in a small bowl once every day or every other day, at least 3 times a week. Handling is probably not a good idea. I mean, they have a similar temperament to day geckos, which, if you've ever even attempted to handle a day gecko, you know what I'm talking about. No, but seriously, I don't think handling them is a good idea since they're so small and skittish. They easily get lost or get hurt. The psychedelic gecko is more of a display species than one you can actually interact with. If you want a lesser-known gecko that's good with handling, look into my episode on the Wellington green gecko. Generally, the larger species are more mellow than the tiny ones, such as with most species we cover here. And this is even more important since they're already endangered, but I'd only recommend this species if your main intent is breeding, otherwise the population could suffer even more. Speaking of breeding, however, there's a few different things involved for the psychedelic gecko, though I'd say they're on par with most day geckos in this aspect. In the wild, these geckos are known to hide their eggs in crevices of rocks and boulders, so you might not initially know if they laid any eggs at all. A good way to hack this would be to leave a lay box in their enclosure for them, and maybe check it once a day or something like that. A box of sphagnum moss is all they need to lay their eggs in. Once you find them, they'll be stuck to whatever object they lay them on. The sticky substance is known as egg glue, though I'm not sure what the scientific term for it is. Other than that, like most geckos, they only lay a clutch consisting of 2 eggs. Feel free to house a male and female together during their mating season, but no longer than that. There is little to no documented sexual dimorphism, considering both sexes have the same unique coloration. Juveniles look identical as well. The gestation period also isn't well documented, but their mating season could be judged to be around monsoon season, since that's when their population spikes, generally. Since this species is oviparous, as customary, I need to mention the fact that incubation is a necessity. However, gecko egg incubation is a lot simpler than most reptile egg incubation. You could put them in a small plastic container with the substrate of sphagnum moss or Repashy Super Hatch. I'd probably recommend getting one of the huge bottles so you won't run out as fast if you go this route. With the eggs in the substrate, make sure the container is always around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, otherwise the eggs will not survive. For more descriptive info, I'd recommend checking out Tiki's Geckos' video on crested gecko egg incubation. Yes, they're from different parts of the world, but the conditions are roughly the same, just up the temperature by a little. I'd recommend brumating your psychedelic gecko if they produce eggs that year. Brumation is the reptile equivalent of mammalian hibernation. This benefits the animal physically because it makes it easier for them to survive during extremely cold winters, but it's also functionally a resting period for their body. To let them know it's time for brumation, a lot of keepers will simply shut their lights off during the winter and not leave food in the enclosure. During this period, you might still see them come out for water or to bask a little bit, but for the most part, they like to stay sedentary during this time. But I think that's going to be all for this installment of Herp Corner. As always, sources will be in the description. If you're interested in the topic, I'd recommend looking further into their husbandry or history. If you learned something new with this one, feel free to subscribe. I do these every other week. Like the video to support the channel. Have a good evening, morning, or afternoon. Thank you for listening, watching, whatever, and I'll see you next time.